Dr. Afolabi, thank you so much. Olowo Okere, who is the head of economic research at the SEC, is also an economist. So let's take a bit of what he has said into this bigger, for broader economic street watch conversation with Dr. Nonso Obikili, who is a professor of economics and the chief economist at Business Day, a newspaper, is live to us from our Abuja studios. Nonso, Doctor, thank you so much. It's good to have you on the show this morning.
Happy to be here.
Great. So let's just take this conversation straight from part of what Dr. Afolabi Olowo-Okere spoke about, Nigeria's food security, food sufficiency conversation, the conversation around the FX restrictions on food imports. What's your take on this? Let's tee this conversation off on that point.
Well, I think there are two things. The first is the food security issue. There is the misconception that food security means growing your own food, but that isn't necessarily the case. Food security is about always having access to food. And so, yes, you want to grow some, but you also want to maintain links to markets that can allow you to buy some in the event that something happens to your own domestic production. And of course, you have to have the income from non-agricultural sources that would allow you to be able to buy food in the event that something goes wrong with your domestic production. So food security isn't just about growing your own food, it's about always having access to food. And then there's the second way to think about it. Now, it's not the case that Nigeria's food production is just stagnant. It's growing. It's been growing for a long time. If you look at agricultural GDP, it's been growing for almost 2 decades nonstop. If you look at the actual crops like rice, like maize, it's been growing for 10 years or so. But the challenge is that domestic consumption is growing faster than production. And so the policy has to be geared not towards closing an imaginary gap for 1 year, but towards how do you get domestic production to grow faster than domestic consumption. And that's a big challenge. It's not a challenge that you can solve with just restricting FX. It's not a challenge that is true for any particular crop. It's a challenge that is broad across most of the industry. It's a challenge about yields, about infrastructure, and about many things that kind of limit the productivity of our agricultural sector. And so that's where the focus needs to be. How do we get growth faster than the growth of domestic consumption?
You did a blog just about 2 weeks ago on the import of milk, for example, into Nigeria, and I just read through that through yesterday, and what the central bank is also pursuing as far as the ban on imported milk, or at least banning FX from the central bank to source for imported milk. What's your bottom line here? And I'm sure you've seen in the news, Promasido yesterday putting pen to paper with Ekiti State government to revitalize a dairy farm that Ekiti State has under Governor Fayemi. So when you see developments like in Ekiti State yesterday, what does it mean to you as an economist who takes a broad and holistic view of milk or dairy production in Nigeria and how we should move forward?
I know you have the same challenge, right? Again, it's not the case that our dairy sector is inactive. It's growing, and it's been growing for a while. The Promasido deal started even before the CBN announced its ban on milk importation, because there's opportunities that farmers are trying to exploit. And over the past 5 years, we've seen some dairy companies, mostly in the yogurt space, expand and grow their production. So it's not the case that our milk sector is dead. It's not. It's growing. But the question is, how do you make it grow even faster than it is? Now, I don't think that the FX ban actually helps that. We've seen a couple of companies like the one in Kaduna complain that the ban actually makes their strategy a bit weaker than before. And it's difficult to say how an FX ban will fix things like having a cold chain infrastructure. It's difficult to say how an FX ban will fix things like having the ease of access to move milk across the country. FX bans don't change that, right? Those problems are still there. An FX ban doesn't change the productivity of cows. An FX ban doesn't solve the satisfied problem we have with the breed of cows that we have. So an FX ban isn't going to change the dynamics in the industry. What it will do is it will make it harder for more firms to generate activity in that space. Because for every firm, you have to import some of your components, you have to import some of your production. You can't close a demand gap in 1 year or 2 years. There will still need to be imports. But for companies who operate in that space now, an FX ban means that they will not be able to operate anymore. And what you typically have is companies who are more open to operating on the fringes, operating through informal sector workers, informal sector spaces, will start to dominate. And once you have that kind of situation, you have questions of quality, you have questions of lost taxes, you have all sorts of problems with moving production into the informal sector. So I think overall, the FX ban will be negative for the milk industry. And it's even more worrying if you take into account that milk is something that is essential for children, right? The first 1,000 years of a child's life is the most important in terms of cognitive ability. And it's difficult to argue that we should stop, spending $330 million worth of milk or so per year, just so that our children can have the best possible milk, the cheapest milk possible. I mean, it's a difficult argument to make. You could argue it for fuel, which we also import in billions. You could argue it for some other products, which we import in billions. But milk is a particularly sensitive one because it's so fundamental for children. And as we know from other data, we have challenges with nutrition in many parts of the country. We have many parts of the country where people don't have access to quality food. And so if you take all that into account, it's difficult to see how a milk ban is a positive. Or a milk FX ban is a positive.
Do you think, Professor, do you think Nigeria is under some pressure as we speak when it comes to the FX size that we have in terms of inflows and outflows and the state of the Naira and all of that? Do you think the monetary authorities and, of course, the fiscal authorities are under pressure as we speak?
Well, that's the second side of the equation, right? We know that they're under pressure because once you start to hear things like we need to restrict FX access to this or to that, you know that there might be a problem, there might be an underlying problem. If we had all the FX we needed, then we would not need to talk about banning this or banning that, right? We would just do what we want. But we don't have, and there's the sense that there's pressure on the exchange rates, which is the underlying factor behind the CBN starting to take some of these demand management actions. And the question is, how do you deal with foreign exchange pressure? And as we've learned from the last 4 years, and even from our previous history, restricting access is not a particularly good solution because you destroy economic activity in the process. The best way to deal with FX challenges is to allow flexibility, to allow prices change so that demand and supply can meet up. That's the best thing to do. And of course, you have to take that into account, the overall structural problem with Nigeria, which is that our exports are dominated only by crude oil. If you look at our imports, they look very normal. We don't import more milk per person than Ghana or than India. We don't import more food than any other country per person. But our exports are dominated by only one commodity, and that's crude oil. And that's where the focus needs to be. Right? It's not just about what do you import, but it's about what do you export. And if you export only crude oil and the crude oil price changes or shocks, then you have problems. So that's where the focus needs to be. And you don't diversify your export basket by banning imports. You don't. It doesn't happen that way.
So, we expect the new cabinet ministers to take office between today, tomorrow, and perhaps the weekend. Today's Wednesday. Technically, they should be having their first cabinet meeting as we speak. But of course, yesterday, they concluded their presidential ministerial retreat as trainees. Now they got to become full-time ministers. What do you think the fiscal authority should do? Because when Mr. President says, look, I've directed central bank not to give a dime to anyone who wants to import food into the country. That was a statement of intent there. But some folks have said this, that, look, this is not a central bank or monetary policy issue. This is a fiscal issue, some of the structural issues that you discussed earlier. So how do you think the current cabinet and Mr. President himself should fix the fiscal side of things, perhaps to help us ensure that we can achieve some of the things perhaps that the central bank wants to get done under the 41-item policy focus?
Well, you hope that cabinet is a place where policy is debated. And even though you want them to come out with a unified front, as you would expect, you hope that within closed doors, while they have their deliberations, there's debate on what the strategy should be. And I hope that the focus would be on how do you diversify your export basket, because that's the real challenge, right? As long as we have crude oil and natural gas as 95% of all our exports, we will keep on having these foreign exchange challenges. That's a given. It doesn't matter what we do on the import side. As long as the export side is still crude oil, we'll keep on having challenges. So we hope that the debates in cabinet will be how do you start to change this structure of the Nigerian export story. And you're right, it's not something that can be done by the CBN. The CBN is just a monetary policy authority. The CBN does not know how to teach farmers how to improve their yields. The CBN does not build roads. The CBN does not secure the infrastructure. The CBN does not prevent informal taxation on the roads. The CBN can't do all that. Those are things that have to be done by the government itself. And we hope that within cabinet, there'll be enough debates about how to do that and about how to allow the CBN focus on its core mandate. Let's not forget the CBN has a core mandate of monetary stability, of macroeconomic stability. And every time it gets distracted by trying to do something like, in the rice space or in the textile space, it loses focus on its core mandate. And that's something that is very, very dangerous. If you have macroeconomic instability, then it doesn't matter what else you do, your economy can't grow. If you have instability, it doesn't matter what else you do, you can't create jobs. So we hope that the cabinet will shift the focus back towards the fiscal space and allow the central bank to focus on its core mandate. Now, what can they do? There's a lot that they can do. Nigerian yields are one of the lowest in the world for many crops. For rice, for maize, for sesame seeds, almost every crop you can imagine, maybe except yams. Our yields are very low, which means that there's a lot of space to improve our productivity. But that's not about FX. That's about extension services. That's about training for farmers. That's about farmers having access to markets where they can sell their crops at competitive prices. That's a lot of things that have to happen in the fiscal space, right? And of course, you have things like infrastructure challenges, feeder routes from farms to markets, security, and all that. And we hope that the cabinet will be able to, debate within themselves about how to change direction. And I mean, it's fine for the president to have a direction. I mean, that's what we expect presidents to have a direction as well. There's nothing wrong with that. But you want the cabinet to be able to convince the president that, a particular action should or should not be taken. You want the cabinet to be able to convince the president that, doing A is good and doing B is maybe not so good. And so I hope that with the new cabinet, we'll have enough of that kind of robust discussion about how to, shift the focus.
Dr. Obikili, let's end this conversation on this very interesting issue of tax revenue. The last 2-3 days, of course, everyone reported, including Business Day, the query to the FRS chief about the declining tax revenue collection and the response provided by the head of the tax agency, Babatunde Fowler. So how much pressure do you think the administration is currently with all the notices that FRS is pushing out in terms of those who have a lien on their bank accounts who are owing, and it says, look, at the end of 30 days, this was issued on Monday, directors, managing directors, company secretaries will be penalized for outstanding taxes. Then it moved on to say you have to pay taxes, especially for companies in the FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods, when it comes to commissions and benefits or rebates that you give to customers. Where are we with the tax revenue issue here, weighing the response of Babatunde Fowler yesterday on why we've had low tax revenue?
Okay, I mean, it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that has been there for some time. We talk about the actual nominal taxes all the time, but if you look at taxes as a share of GDP, or taxes in real terms, it's actually been falling since about 2013 or so. Which means that even though we are collecting more, we're not collecting as much as we should, even if we were keeping the same ratio going. And it's part of a structural problem. In the 80s, we built a fiscal structure around how to share all revenues. And it was fine then, because the oil industry was big, it was about 30% of GDP. Oil revenue was about 25% of GDP. So it was enough to fund the government. And the question then was, how do you distribute that oil revenue equitably? But the economy has changed since then. Now, the crude oil industry is only about 9%, and so oil revenue is a very small number. But we still have the same old structure. We still have the same old FAC committee trying to distribute revenues. We still have the same personal income taxes collected only by states. We still have that structure, and we've kind of made FRS try to work hard, but FRS is working hard within that structure that is not designed for tax collection. And so I think in the near term, we need a more fundamental reform of the tax structure itself. If you think about personal income taxes, for example, in many countries, PIT makes up about 30% of all revenues. But in Nigeria, it's a very, very small fraction. And that's because the FIRS actually has no rights to go after personal income taxes. The FIRS has no rights to go after high net worth individuals. And so their potential is limited. But the state governments don't have the capacity to chase the HNIs. They just don't. And so we have all these problems with our tax structure, where we have designed a structure that was good during the all-boom days, but is no longer sufficient now. So even though we want FIRS to work harder, we need a more fundamental reform of the tax structure. A reform that changes the incentives over who collects what, who keeps what, and who can spend what. I think that's where I hope that the story will go over the next 4 years. Because it's not something that, we can try to work harder. That might work a little bit. But if the structure is not adequate, then working hard won't deliver results. You need a more fundamental reform.
Dr. Nonso Obikili, thank you so much. A professor of economics and the chief economist at Business Day newspaper. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate your contributions to some of the biggest economic stories making the headlines right now in the country. Thank you so much. Do have a great day and enjoy the rest of your week. Looking forward to have you on the show again.
Thank you.
We appreciate that. When we come back, we're taking a look at the debt market. And of course, we're checking with today's trading day at the Nigerian Stock Exchange. It's still early morning, but just a few minutes to the top of the hour.